GSP is truly an MMA legend, one of the all-time greats, 26-2 with all losses avenged in convincing fashion with very tough competition. In 2013 he retired at the top, setting the record for most wins in championship fights and the second longest title reign in UFC history at 2,204 days with 9 straight title defenses. He then made a comeback in 2017 where he defeated Michael Bisping by submission, additionally winning the middleweight title and becoming one of the only 4 UFC fighters to win championships in different weight classes. What made GSP stand out so much from the rest of the competition? Of course he had the basic prerequisites of elite level competition such as work ethic, athleticism and fight IQ, and additionally he was the poster boy of a well-rounded fighter. He could do everything. He could wrestle, he could box, he could kick, he could grapple, all in a world-class fashion. He could do all of it. He was probably the first MMA fighter that lived up to the term well-rounded. But there is one department where he stood out tremendously from the rest of the competition. And that was his ability to seek out the right expertise. And combine this with the fact of his extremely curious and coachable personality, and athletes like this become like sponges, just soaking in knowledge and guidance. He was simply a master of seeking out the right guidance and being a model student. And this was not only exclusive to the sport itself, but also the strength and conditioning aspect. If we explore the available footage of GSP's training, he does every single scientifically researched method for strength and power development. Those include compound lifts, plyometrics, Olympic weightlifting, ballistic training, as well as accessory lifts for injury prevention and stability. On top of all of this, to further improve his movement competency, he does something a bit unconventional in MMA, namely gymnastics. We will go into this a bit later. Now here's the thing, in a lot of interviews we can hear GSP saying something in the fashion of "I don't do strength and conditioning" or "I don't do it for performance reasons" and etc. But I believe a lot of people take this out of context. I believe the point he's trying to make is that you should not sacrifice your standard MMA training and all the skill work for strength and conditioning if you believe that's gonna make you a superior fighter. And this point I absolutely agree with. Don't confuse cause and effect. All of those world-class competitors such as GSP and John Jones and Demetrius Johnson, they are not all-time greats because of their athletic attributes alone. More importantly, they are masters of skills and efficiency. Strength and conditioning is merely icing on the cake. So if you're an aspiring fighter and want to grow in the sport, you cannot substitute skill work with strength and conditioning. You must see it as a complement that takes up a smaller part of your overall schedule. And this is the way GSP approached it. It only becomes productive if you're already putting in the hours in your standard combat sports training and you're growing your skill set. With that being said, how did his strength and conditioning routine look like? I decided to get to the root of the matter by researching the methodology of his strength and conditioning coach. Following his loss to Matt Serra in 2008 and a couple of injuries here and there, GSP wanted to make some changes, and he saw the strength and conditioning department that needed improvement, so he hired Jonathan Chainberg. So the main chunk of this video is based on a 50-minute podcast with Jonathan Chainberg, which I transcribed and then filtered out the key points. If we observe the old training footage of GSP before he started working with Chainberg, we could see that he was mostly doing some general calisthenics and just basic fitness exercises. Chainberg said that when he began working with GSP, he could only do about 8 pull-ups and he could only press about 55 pounds dumbbells. And this was at a time where he had already beaten opponents such as Matt Hughes and he was already a world champion, which a lot of people find surprising. But it only goes to show how high his skill set is and how high his further margin of improvement was in the strength and power department, which they would then address. After their training intervention, Chainberg stated that he could do pull-ups with 8 reps with 80 pounds around his waist as well as triples on 100 pounds. Additionally, he was pressing 120 pounds dumbbells. Overall, Chainberg described him as freakishly strong and an athletic freak, which we can all agree with. Here is some footage of him performing plyometrics with 50-inch hurdles, and the power production and the utilization of the stretch shortening cycle here is remarkable. This power and bounciness and overall twitch is comparable to a track and field jumper that does this for a living. It is very remarkable, and he is truly an athletic freak by observing this footage alone. As I have discussed in my past videos, the purpose of plyometrics is to improve the body's utilization of elastic energy, which is done by improving the time between concentric and eccentric contraction. The quicker this is done, the more you can utilize this rubber band effect and the more power you can generate. This is a training intervention in its own. And here we can see him performing some Olympic weightlifting variations, more specifically the power snatch. And apparently he was learning this under the guidance of world-class Olympic weightlifting coach Pierre of Canada, and this is truly testament of his ability to seek out the right expertise once again. And the point of Olympic weightlifting variations for athletic performance is total body power development, moving fast weights or producing force in short amounts of time. That is power production once again. And in this particular training instrument you emphasize the triple extension phase, and that is extension of the hips, knees and ankles. The rapid extension of those will transfer to a great multitude of sporting movements. And here we can see him perform a back squat jump, which is a subcategory of ballistic training. And the point with ballistic training is to maximize the acceleration phase of exercises. For instance, if you perform a standard back squat, you stop at the end and your power production is mostly U-shaped because you have to stop at the end. But in a ballistic variation such as the back squat, you continue accelerating with the weight upwards, so the power production is constant in like a linear line, so to speak. So if you in your sport perform anything of projectile nature where you have to continue accelerating the force, such as a double leg takedown entry and an extension of the body, this could prove useful. A typical strength and conditioning day for GSP according to Chamberg would look something like this. Number 1, we start with an active warm-up to loosen up the joints, increase the body temperature, prevent injuries. And then first thing first, we have the power and speed exercises, because those are the most mentally demanded exercises of all, arguably, because you have to produce powerful actions in short amounts of time. So we have hurdles, 50 inches or so, and then we have Olympic weightlifting variations. And then they would go over to the main strength exercise of the day, which would probably be weighted chin-ups or pressing variations or squatting variations, and then they would end with accessory exercises to target isolated muscle groups that are otherwise hard to target with the bigger compound lifts. Chamberg says that he looks at certain movements and he assesses their biomechanics, such as their bodily restrictions, from what is known as a functional movement screen. And then he adds appropriate exercises for each individual, including GSP, to address those. He says he can immediately assess their strength level from basic exercises such as how many chin-ups they can do, and whether they can do something such as a single leg squat to a significant depth, and from there he does his assessment and he adds an appropriate training intervention. And this is actually not a bad idea at all, because you cannot be doing 1 repetition max exercises with like deadlifts and squats with people that are not experienced in it, not used to it. It is way too risky. A max out is a skill by itself. It takes a lot of time to learn how to do it, and you should definitely not do it with new athletes. Chamberg is pretty big on functional training exercises. Now, functional training is quite a loaded topic and there is quite a gray zone in this term. But the general definition is really that it focuses on training the body for activities performed in daily life or the activity you're preparing for in question. Instead of, say, overly relying on traditional compound exercises such as the bench press, the barbell back squats and the deadlifts, you would prioritize more movement challenging exercises such as the one-arm push-ups or full barbell rollouts or Bulgarian split squats. Instead of emphasizing too much bilateral exercises, such as the back squat which is done on both legs, you would also emphasize unilateral work such as Bulgarian split squats, which is done on one leg at a time, with the rationale that most sporting scenarios consist of one leg at a time, unilaterally that is, instead of bilaterally like 2 legs at a time. And this is a plausible argument, although personally, when I train my athletes, I keep a mix of both modalities, both unilateral and bilateral exercises, which I am probably sure Chamberg does as well to a certain extent. It is just a matter of prioritization, I assume. The functional training approach is a cornerstone in the training methods by coaches such as Mike Boyle. You can read his works if you want to learn more about it. Chamberg is big on targeting individual weaknesses of his athletes, including GSP. He especially looks at the hip area as well as the knees. And those smaller muscle groups act as stabilizers, and they have to be strong to protect the body. He said that GSP would get injured pretty frequently, but after working with him, he didn't have any significant injuries since 2.5 years. And this is one major importance of a good strength training intervention. If we even put the performance aspects aside, one significant aspect that makes it worth it to do for this reason alone is strengthening of stabilizers and injury prevention, provided that you have a good plan under good guidance. Chamberg says that most people, they have weak stabilizers, and he looks primarily at those and he builds a program based on that. And this part I highly agree with, because many times we're often focused on the big compound exercises while ignoring the stabilizers through smaller specialized exercises. And of course there needs to be a balance of both compound exercises and isolated lifts. Every major joint of the body has some stabilizer muscles that will help in their integrity, and training those specifically is of high importance. The main outline, so to speak, is often similar for all athletes, but then it gets individualized based on the athlete's weaknesses. And oftentimes this is evident by some observations simply. For instance, it may be evident in the squat that one athlete uses the hip flexors more than the knee flexors, for instance, or that one certain part of their body collapses, etc. Issues like this are always related to one of the following reasons. Number one, it is a technique issue. And number two, it might be a bodily restriction, such as mobility issues in one certain body part. Or number three, it might be underdeveloped stabilizer muscles. So, instead of trying to guess your way of which it is and to which proportion, which is not always easy, the most plausible solution is to simply work on all of them at all times. Not only will those stabilizers muscles actually aid you in your bigger compound exercises, but they will also aid in injury prevention, and it becomes like a winning circle. For example, if we take a bilateral back squat, which is a compound exercise, all effort is evenly spread out in all core and leg muscles, while in a unilateral Bulgarian split squat variations, singular muscles get more heavily emphasized. Once again, I include an even balance of both of them. And then it talks about the importance of training different movement patterns and planes, whether doing strength training, power training, or endurance. An athlete must be evenly developed on all planes of movement, especially in such a dynamic sport such as MMA. In MMA you push, you pull, it is a lateral plane, it is a horizontal plane, vertical plane, everything is really involved, and there is a designated exercise for every movement plane, strengthening it that is. When it comes to the endurance, Chamberg is big on high intensity interval training, or an anaerobic emphasis when it comes to endurance. Why is that? Because if you engage in, let's say, lengthy steady state cardio, let's say a 10-kilometer run or a 20-kilometer run, you're only emphasizing the aerobic system. But if you emphasize the high intensity interval trainings, anaerobic endurance that is, then you get both anaerobic system and the aerobic system. Both of them are emphasized. It is two birds in one stone. So if you run for a 10-kilometer run, you will not develop high intensity endurance. But if you do high intensity endurance, you will get high intensity endurance plus low intensity endurance. So it's two birds in one stone. And there is tons of research behind this training modality. High intensity interval training is one of the most rigorously researched methods for endurance developments, and it closely mimics the demands of MMA. He exaggerated this point by saying that 140 seconds of high intensity work can get you the same benefits of, say, 60 minutes of low intensity work. Of course, it's a simplification, but it makes a clear point. And he further states that a busy athlete with so many training sessions, why would you deliberately perform a training method that not only is inefficient to the demands of MMA but also of longer duration, lengthy steady state cardio that is. In essence, by performing high intensity intervals and short sprints, it is more efficient for MMA than lengthy steady state cardio, on a general basis at least. Now here we are not disregarding the importance of aerobic metabolism, that is not the point, we are only discussing the optimal means of achieving it. And then he said something that I found pretty amusing, a fault which many MMA fighters succumb to. He referred to it as the Rich Franklin syndrome. Basically it means that you are working incredibly hard but at the wrong thing, and he used Rich Franklin as an example for this, because he was working so hard at a lengthy steady state endurance training that he ultimately became a slow-paced aerobic fighter because his anaerobic qualities was suffering because of this. And there is science behind this actually, because to a certain extent there is a scarcity in energetic attributes in the body. So by going overboard on slow intensity, long duration endurance, you will sacrifice your powerful anaerobic capacity to a certain extent because of this, and you lose this twitchiness. So in MMA, this low intensity endurance and over reliance on aerobic capacity, that is, it will only work against a certain type of opponent. If you are faced with what I like to call a type 2A fighter, you will be in trouble. Because those kinds of fighters, they have a ridiculous tank of what Chamber refers to as power endurance, or anaerobic endurance in other words. That is, they can maintain a high pace for 5 rounds. This is the kryptonite of slow twitch fighters. GSP certainly fit into this category. Some other notable examples are Khabib and Alexander Volkanovski. And how do they progress from session to session when it comes to endurance? Chamberg says he gauges their fatigue level through relevant metrics such as heart rate and their time to recovery, and he sets benchmarks for them. For example, on the air bike, he gives them a target in terms of RPM. Basically, it is about keeping track of all relevant metrics, the more the better, and setting benchmarks for current and future sessions. And this is a great approach. I do the exact same thing with my athletes, because the last thing you want to do as a competitor is to just aimlessly go through all workouts simply on autopilot, because then you won't achieve anything worthwhile and you will not have a sense of control. I recommend that you always maintain track of your metrics and your results, and this is regardless of whether you're doing strength training or endurance or power. Keep adjusting and set benchmarks for yourself. Track your fatigue levels. If you one day generated X amounts of power on an average heart rate of 170, but 1 week later generated that power on a heart rate of 180, then something is probably off and you need to make adjustments. Controlling those variables and keeping a track of them is how you avoid overtraining, which is another huge component of strength and conditioning and sports in general. As for the equipment itself, Chamberg says that he is big on air bikes as well as sleds. He also implements shuttle runs, battle ropes, and often in a Tabata style interval format. Another research topic. And now we get to what in my view is the highlight of the entire podcast, and that is people talking about influential legends in various combat sports such as Fedor or Floyd, Khabib, Muhammad Ali, whoever it is, and they say things such as, but he did a lot of distance running and this and that, he didn't do compound lifts, he didn't do plyometrics or power cleans, and they still reached the top. And once again, this is confusing cause and effect. Those athletes were not in the world class because they did distance running to begin with. They were already so far ahead of everyone else in terms of skill, and because of this advantage, because of them being those chess masters in the game, they could do almost any routine they wanted to and they would still be far ahead of the curve because of this aspect alone. It was so good compared to the other aspects, it became their X factor sort of. Ironically, had those athletes, in addition to their world-class skill, approached their strength and conditioning smarter, well, guess what? They would be even better than they were. And this is a terrifying thought when you think about it. If they were already this good with a subpar strength and conditioning routine, imagine if they had engaged in a good one. And second, another point that Chamberg talked about is that those athletes, when they approach their training session, when they do the pads or takedowns or sparring, they do so with very explosive and twitchy intentions, the manner that is. When Fedor or Khabib went for a double leg takedown, or when they hit the pads, they were actively recruiting those fast twitch muscle fibers and tons of motor units, and they were actively working on their power production because of this. So a lot of people forget this, but a wrestling practice or a boxing practice in itself, if you approach it in the right manner, it is already a strength and conditioning workout, because it is of so intense nature. And this begs the question once again, okay, then what is the point of doing strength and conditioning in the first place if a boxing session is already strength and conditioning? Well, once again, it's specialization. You isolate components that are otherwise hard to isolate in boxing or MMA, but that adds up to the bigger picture. In his training approach with George, he implements a lot of complexes. For example, after completing a classic strength move such as heavy-weighted pull-ups, he transitions immediately into explosive medicine ball slams. And with this, his rationale is to train the muscles to produce power under conditions of fatigue, to achieve this under fatigue, that is. So he implements very long and negative portions on the exercises to induce this fatigue, and then he goes over to a power exercise. And one thing I can notice here is that he instructs George to go max effort on each rep, whether that is pulling, whatever the exercise that is, on the concentric portion to go maximum speed on it, recruit as many motor units as possible to develop explosive intentions, and this is an excellent approach. I really love it, very scientifically researched, and I train my athletes the same way, and you should do as well. And then he goes into the work to rest ratios in MMA and how there is a negative one in MMA, which he is absolutely right on. And this is a huge problem with combat sports, because not only do you need to display constant endurance in high pace, but you also do not get enough rest between rounds, that is. We work more than we rest. It's 5-minute rounds with 1 minute rest in between. This means that we must train our ability to persist under states of extreme fatigue, and we have to be very smart and efficient with our energy expenditure. In a sport like MMA, we need aerobic endurance, anaerobic endurance, strength, power and speed and all of it, and they all have their optimal solution. With so many areas to emphasize, how do we put everything together? And the simple answer to that is periodization, another thing that he went into, which is focusing on one attribute at a time. The further away you are from competition, the more you can work on general attributes, and the closer you get, the more you have to mimic the demands of a fight. So for example, in the off season you could do a general preparation phase, and then you go into a strength phase, and then you go into a power phase, and in the last 3 weeks or 1 month or so leading up to a fight, you go all in on high intensity endurance. And another very important point when we're talking about periodization is that no component is ever neglected. For instance, if one block is prioritized for strength, it does not mean that you neglect power or that you neglect endurance or aerobic endurance or anaerobic endurance, whatever the case might be. It simply means that you prioritize this one component over the others. It's not a black and white kind of matter. It's not 100 and 0. You need to see the gray zone of things. You need to maintain all other attributes also. And one very interesting point that he talked about is assessing the margin of improvement for the athlete. For example, if someone is blessed with a world-class gas tank, they never get tired, they can run on laps for ends, go 10 rounds in sparring, whatever the case might be, then the highest margin of improvement is probably strength and power. They are probably weaker there. So maintain this endurance that they have and work a little bit on strength and power, and they will grow a lot more from that. And he used BJ Penn and his trainer as an example for this. For example, BJ Penn is very good in terms of flexibility and mobility and balance and those kind of things. And he's designating a lot of training time to further improve this. So his point is that, okay, if you're already so good in this one quality, what difference does it really make if you get 2% better in it? Why not focus on something that you have not been doing, such as anaerobic capacity or power and strength, and get maybe 100% better than that? The margin of improvement for you is much higher here. So maintain the strengths that you have, but prioritize other components that you have a high margin of improvement in. And that is the point. Fantastic point. I absolutely agree. And finally, we need to talk about the gymnastics. Why does GSP try to learn gymnastics? What is his rationale? And for this, I looked into his book, The Way of the Fight, and he says that he emphasizes being open to learning from various sports. He initially disregarded gymnastics, he thought it was irrelevant to MMA, but he later recognized its values, and this is because of its athleticism. He notices their ability to generate power from awkward position, which he says is a crucial ability in MMA, where fighters often find themselves in challenging positions and they need to exert force effectively. And then gymnastics, he says, demands high levels of balance and strength and flexibility, and once again those are essential in MMA as well. Now you need to see those things in context. In GSP's situation, who is already world class in MMA, he can wrestle, he can box, he can kick, he can do all of it. He is the epitome of a well-rounded fighter that is highly developed in every aspect. For him, there is probably a high margin of improvement, yes, in trying to learn another attribute on top of that, which in this case is gymnastics, and this is called cross-training. That is, you engage in another training modality that is different from your own thing to learn movement scenarios and coordinations and changes of directions and muscle groups that are normally not so evident in your own sport. So this arms you with new tools that you can then utilize, and this is the purpose of it. It's called cross-training, and once again, this is in GSP's case very productive. But you, for example, if you have not mastered the boxing or the wrestling or the kicking game yet, it's probably not a plausible idea for you. You need to see it in context.